So, Paul, this was certainly I don't know really how to describe this press conference this past week with Donald Trump, ostensibly about his veterans organization donation. Just give us before we actually get to the conference and what it is, what it indicates. But just give us a sense of what was this whole veterans donation story.
Okay, so back in January, Trump decided that he was going to boycott one of the debates that was hosted by Fox News because he was mad at how they had been covering him. He had an acute sense of fairness, and when anyone is being what he calls unfair to him, he wants to find a way to get back at them. So he said that instead of going to the debate, he was going to hold a fundraiser for veterans. They had this rally, and at the rally, he said a number of times, "We've raised $6 million. Isn't that terrific?" He also said, "I am writing a $1 million check to veterans groups." So that happened in January. The months pass, and after a while, some reporters, particularly David Farenthold of the Washington Post, begin to inquire into this. How much money did they actually raise? Where did it go? Did Trump actually give the money that he claimed? And they began to ask these questions. And then there was a report in the Washington Post, I believe on May 23rd, saying that it looks like they didn't actually raise as much as they had claimed, and there was no evidence that Trump ever wrote a check for $1 million. Well, it turns out that very day, once that article appeared in the Washington Post, all of a sudden a bunch of checks were written, including a check from Donald Trump to a veterans group, so that it appears that the money would actually end up going out. And one of the interesting notes to this is that when Farenthold got a chance to interview Trump a couple of days later, he asked him what you would think would be a perfectly reasonable question, which is, did you just make your donation only because these questions had been raised and this article appeared in the paper? And Trump's reply, you would expect, would be, "Oh, no, of course not. It just took some time." His reply was, "You're a very nasty guy." So just the very fact that this reporter asked him a question about it, he turned into an accusation of his moral value, which is what Trump often does. So that's kind of the background. And then these questions continued to be raised. That the reporters, they called up all of these veterans groups, got all the details about it, and apparently Trump felt enough pressure from all of these questions being raised that he felt like he had to come out and give a press conference about it.
And so, I imagine by now most people have heard it, but tell us how that press conference went.
Well, in many ways, it was sort of typical Trump. He came out and immediately started talking about how great he's doing in the polls, which is what he does in every single public appearance he makes. And then he read off a list of the different veterans groups that had gotten the money, and said that they had raised $5.6 million, which was almost the $6 million he claimed at on that evening. He didn't actually talk about his own $1 million contribution, but then he just kind of went off on a rant about reporters and how they're so dishonest and how they're the worst people. And when they started to get the chance to ask him some questions, all of which were perfectly respectful and, just asking for details, he would reply to the questions with a real kind of anger and venom. At one point, he looked at one reporter for ABC News and said, "You're a sleaze." Why? Because the reporter had just asked him about his penchant for exaggeration, which is something that's longstanding. And I think in one of Trump's books, he even admitted that, sometimes he exaggerates just to sort of, promote his projects and thinks it's a very effective means of public relations. So this reporter asked him about that, and Trump said, "You're a sleaze." It was a particularly vivid example of the kind of way that Trump treats the press in general, which is that he expects to be praised and lauded and celebrated, and if he doesn't get that from reporters, then he gets extremely angry and vindictive. And he even said in the press conference that they should have said, "Thank you, Mr. Trump." That's what the reporting on this issue should have been. Literally, he said, you should have said, "Thank you, Mr. Trump," but instead they were asking questions and criticizing him, and how dare they do that. So I think it was unusually revealing of the kind of perspective he has on the media. Not that their job is to hold powerful people accountable or explain the whole story to their audiences. Their job is to praise him, and if they don't do that, then they're being terribly unfair, and it makes them horrible people.
Now, I've got to push back on this a little bit. Because do you really think that? I mean, do you think that this is he's having a sort of a psychological or like some type of emotional response, or that he actually believes any of that, or do you perceive this as a tactic?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, on the one hand, you can say he certainly wouldn't be the first person in politics to realize that you can shape the coverage that you get by keeping reporters under pressure. That was part of the strategy behind the many decade-long conservative effort to accuse the press of liberal bias. Not that conservatives didn't believe it, they certainly do, but they also understood that those constant accusations of bias can make reporters bend over backward to prove you wrong, and therefore you end up getting a lot better coverage.
That's what Eric Alterman would call working the refs, right?
Yeah.
It's just that what we're seeing from Trump, it seems to me, is he's not just sort of working the refs like you would see in a normal, a basketball game or, where they start just pressuring the refs and putting some pressure on them. He's actually like going to their house, leaving a dead pigeon on their doorstep. I mean, it seems to me that what we're seeing from Donald Trump is not a big baby, but rather a very strategic and a plan to make it impossible for the press to A, question him, or B, have any legitimacy in the eyes of the voters to bring up anything critical about Donald Trump.
Right, and I think that he has certainly convinced his own supporters of that. It's a different question as to whether he's convinced anyone else. But I think you're right in that sense that there's a strategy behind it. And like many things, Trump takes what other politicians do with kind of subtlety and implication and makes it very, very literal. So he does this in all kinds of ways. Other politicians try to convince you that they're smart, and Trump will literally say, "I have a very big brain." And this is the same thing. So instead of talking about how their coverage is problematic or trying to tell them privately that he had a problem with something that they wrote, he comes out and he says reporters are the worst. They're terrible people. They're dishonest. They're sleaze. And so he's always making everything much more literal, and that's why it can be so jarring. So I think that's certainly part of it, but it's also I think there is something sincere about it in the sense that if you look at the way he deals with so many different people, he really does seem to be utterly unable to let go of a grudge, even when it would be to his advantage. For instance, the other day he was in New Mexico and at a rally, and he started to attack the governor of New Mexico, Susana Martinez, who is kind of a rising star in the Republican Party. She's their only Latina governor. And as the party's nominee, you would think it's important for him to, rally everyone around him and, get as much party unity as he can. And for somebody who's a popular politician in a swing state, maybe going after her is probably not very good politics. But he just couldn't help himself. Why? Because, she had criticized him at some private donor meeting, and she decided not to come to his rally, and he felt like that was a snub. And so he lashed out at her. And you see this again and again, and he even has admitted it in various interviews that when somebody wrongs him as he perceives it, he just cannot let it go, and he's never going to forget that you did him wrong, and he is going to find a way to take vengeance on you if he can. And so and that's obviously something that is potentially troubling in a president. But I think that's part of how Trump deals with the press too. It's that he really does want his coverage to be just glowing in all respects, and if it isn't, he gets really genuinely angry. And I think in cases like this, on the one hand, you can say there's a strategy behind keeping reporters under pressure, but I think you could also argue that it's a terrible strategic mistake to be that abusive, because you're going to just encourage reporters to say, okay, well, we're going to investigate some other stuff. It really kind of brings up in them, I think, their most profound feelings of professionalism.
Now, you say that this is a big mistake in a swing state. And I guess we'll wait and see if the electorally that works out. But it seems to me that his strategy there was to send a message to the rest of the Republican Party. If you mess with me, I don't care who you are, I will slam you into the ground. And it also seems to me that it was doing double duty, because if he wanted to really attack Susana Martinez, he would have used that tape. He would have said, she's so, did you hear that tape of her getting drunk and calling the cops? But no, he used stuff that was part of his sort of, I guess I'm using this in quotes, policy platform, right? It was about, which is attacking Latinos and attacking Syrian refugees. It seems to me that was also designed to say to the rest of the Republican Party, don't mess with me. You better keep your head down. And he did the same thing at the press conference. This is big bully tactics. And how are you so sure it's not going to work?
Well, it's a good question, and there may be a certain subtlety in some cases to his bullying. I think with the reporters, though, it goes to a place where it could really backfire. We were talking about how accusing reporters of liberal bias has been a very effective tactic for conservatives. And one of the reasons that can work is that there's some kind of truth that's at the core of it. So, for instance, if you criticize a reporter who happens to be personally liberal, even if they work very hard at keeping their own beliefs about policy issues out of their reporting, they're always going to suspect that maybe there is something to that criticism. Maybe I'm not doing a good enough job of keeping my own ideas out of it. And so that can be something that even if the reporter is actually offering perfectly objective coverage, that if they really are a liberal and you accuse them of liberal bias, it's going to make them work even harder to give you coverage that makes sure that it isn't biased in any way. The problem, though, for Trump is that once you go beyond that to something that has no truth whatsoever, and you just accuse them of being sleazy and dishonest and nasty just for offering you some relatively critical questions, some probing questions, there's no reporter who thinks that Trump might actually have a reasonable case to make on this issue. And so that kind of just a naked attack on them, I think, is going to cause a lot of reporters to sit back and say, okay, I have a real obligation, to the reasons that I got into this business, to hold powerful people accountable, and if I am a professional, I am not going to allow myself to be bullied like this. And in fact, I'm going to go even farther and start asking these kinds of difficult questions. And so when the next thing comes up, Trump University, I'm not just going to talk about how it's a political problem. I'm going to really try to get the facts and investigate it thoroughly. And that's what produced this in the first place, is because he had this event. And some reporters said, let's really look at this and make sure that he's following through on what he claims and make sure that the things he says are true. And when they started to actually investigate and call up all those veterans groups, which is something that takes a lot of time and effort, they uncovered the facts that led us to where we are now. And the same thing is happening, I think, with the Trump University thing. The judge ordered the release of those documents, and we're seeing, this week that that there's a lot of very damning stuff in those documents, and there are going to be people poring over it and producing stories on what exactly it was and what Trump's involvement in it was, and how close he was to the scamming of all of the people who spent tens of thousands of dollars on those courses. And I think that Trump's attacks are going to encourage reporters to actually do a better job. And the more that happens, the more stuff will come out about him that doesn't reflect very well on who he is.
Right. Yeah. I mean, my sense is that he's probably anticipating a lot of that, and I think to a certain extent, by making such a contentious relationship with the press, he doesn't look like he's being evasive about one thing or another, right? It's just he's not answering these questions about this really legitimate fraud that he may have been caught up in because he just doesn't like the press. I mean, the real question is at what point does he just stop talking to the press, and can he afford to do that? I mean, that's really the question, right? I mean, because he's got this weird symbiotic relationship where he needs the press, at least the attention, because he's not going to necessarily have the money that a traditional candidate would have. It looks like he's going to raise some of it. But, earned media, or free media, as it were, has been his staple. And then I guess the question is, does the media have the ability to sort of not give him that free media unless he engages with them? I don't think they can. Do you?
Well, it'll be an interesting thing. I mean, he's been so good for ratings that they may continue to feel like they have no choice. I mean, he can. The question is, if he just calls into Fox and Friends every day, is that going to be enough for him to get out his message? If they're all planting their cameras at every event that he does, maybe. But he may stop giving all those interviews. But even all along, he has been in some ways much more available to the media than, say, Hillary Clinton has.
Right.
And maybe it's his own overconfidence and bluster that makes him think that he can sort of throw out enough bull to get his way through any interview. But if he shuts all that down, I mean, I think you can still report on the campaign without actually being able to ask him questions, and you can ask the same questions of his aides, his surrogates, other people, and you can just air the facts. And that if Trump personally closes himself off, that doesn't mean that he's going to stop getting that kind of difficult coverage. But part of his message to his own supporters is that they just shouldn't believe anything they see anywhere, whether it's on the national news or it's in the newspaper, unless it comes from a source like Fox that is just going to be completely in the tank for him. It's all going to be a bunch of lies.
Right.
And, as we've seen with the kind of bubble that conservatives have put around themselves, that is maybe internally effective at keeping people's loyalty, but if the people that are convinced of it are a minority of the country, it doesn't get you, across
it doesn't
50%
get you where you need
to
to
win
go.
the presidency.
Indeed. Paul Waldman, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.